On August 11, 1999, at 12:41 p.m., Salt Lake was changed forever by the biggest unexpected tornado ever. A dark funnel touched down on the city's west side. For approximately 14 minutes, it carved a path straight through the capital, slamming into landmarks, tearing apart a convention site, uprooting entire groves of trees, and sending debris swirling high into the air. By the time it lifted at around 12:55 p.m., it had left behind a staggering toll. 1 person dead, more than 80 injured, hundreds of homes and businesses damaged, and roughly $170 million in losses. For Utah, a state that averages only 2 tornadoes a year and rarely stronger than weak F0s or F1s, this was the storm of a century. This was not just a storm. It was a rupture of certainty, proof that even in the high desert, even surrounded by mountains, nature could deliver a blow no one expected. To understand what happened that afternoon, the story must begin with the deceptive calm of an ordinary Wednesday in August, the last few hours before the world tilted. August 11th, 1999. Morning in Salt Lake City opened in routine. The sun rose over the Wasatch, washing the skyline in pale light. By 8 a.m., the valley was already busy. Commuters threaded onto Interstate 15, the hum of engines echoing against the concrete sound walls. State workers filed into the Capitol, carrying briefcases, coffee, and the weight of another summer workday. Tourists filtered into Temple Square, cameras slung around their necks, pausing to admire the fountains and manicured flower beds. It was the height of summer, and the city pulsed with energy. Temperatures were climbing into the mid-80s, and the air carried an unusual heaviness. Locals noticed the humidity clinging to their skin, not oppressive, but noticeable. Afternoon thunderstorms are common in August, so a muggy day wasn't unusual. What few realized was that this extra weight in the air was a sign of fuel waiting for a spark. Inside the Salt Palace Convention Center, crews worked at a frantic pace. The outdoor retailer trade show was one of the city's biggest annual events, drawing thousands of exhibitors from around the country. Forklifts beeped as they moved pallets of gear. Workers hammered together display frames. Across the street, a sprawling tent village had sprung up to house overflow exhibitors. White canopies stood like sails on steel frames. Rows of temporary shops filled with half-unpacked boxes of climbing ropes, tents, and kayaks. The smell of canvas and sawdust mixed in the warm air. By mid-morning, downtown bustled with routine. Office workers slipped into cafes for late breakfasts. Street musicians played violins near City Creek. Construction workers secured scaffolding near the Assembly Hall, their hard hats gleaming in the sun. At the Capitol, staffers walked shaded sidewalks, papers tucked under their arms. The city felt alive, safe, unremarkable. The National Weather Service had issued thunderstorm watches that morning, but they were treated as background noise. Utahns were accustomed to scattered lightning in the afternoons. What no one expected was that one cell would explode with such precision over the city itself. The very idea of a tornado in downtown Salt Lake felt absurd. That disbelief kept people moving through their day without a second thought. By noon, restaurants filled with office workers grabbing lunch. The hum of conversation spilled into the streets. At Temple Square, families posed for photographs beneath flower beds. Vendors at the trade show tents stacked catalogs and sorted gear, pausing only to wipe sweat from their foreheads. The air felt thicker, and shadows deepened as clouds gathered to the northwest. Some people noticed dark bands of sky pushed in, and the wind picked up. Flags snapped taut, tree branches rustled and bent. But the storm still seemed distant. A murmur of thunder rolled across the valley. Nothing unusual, nothing that would interrupt the rhythm of the day. At 12:35 p.m., that rhythm began to crack. A thunderstorm cell near the north end of the valley suddenly strengthened. On radar, meteorologists saw signs of rotation. On the ground, people felt the wind shift. The air turned uneasy, swirling in little eddies. Light dimmed as if evening had come early. The sky lowered, heavy and dark. Minutes later, it happened. At 12:41 p.m., a funnel cloud touched down just west of the city center, near 1300 South and 600 West. Power lines snapped instantly. Transformers exploded in flashes of pink light that lit the skyline. The sound arrived next, a deep growl swelling into a roar. From a news helicopter circling above, cameras captured the first moments. The dark spiral stretched from cloud to ground, its tail flicking across the streets. Reporters watching through monitors couldn't believe what they were seeing as the tornado slammed into the Delta Center, home of the Utah Jazz. One voice broke through.
Clouds started to form just to the south and west of the Delta Center. It went right straight across the Delta Center.
Well, Sterling, we saw it from our beneficial life tower camera. We could see it moving.
Without warning.
There are several fires we can see now burning in the area.
Yes, there were several explosions as it went just to the, there's construction. Well, it didn't go to the construction of the convention center, but there were certainly some explosions just to the south and west of the Delta Center. This is a major tornado for Salt Lake City. I have never seen anything like it in my life. I'm standing here in the crossroads.
The sight was surreal. A tornado ripping open the roof of the city's most famous arena, live on television, in a place where tornadoes weren't supposed to happen. For people on the ground, it was worse. Debris spiraled into the air. Chunks of metal, glass, wood. Workers fled the outdoor tents, some diving behind trees, others clutching poles as the wind lifted them from the ground. In offices, employees crowded windows, staring in disbelief at the black column cutting across their city. On State Street, the storm's violence became clear. By 12:45 p.m., the tornado had intensified to F2 strength, with winds between 113 and 157 miles per hour. It was no longer just a funnel cloud in the distance. It was a predator moving block by block, shredding anything in its path. The roar deepened. Survivors compared it to a freight train barreling through the streets, an unbroken wall of sound that pressed into the chest. The storm chewed through scaffolding at construction sites, ripped signs from their posts, and flung them into traffic. At the convention center, metal poles twisted like drinking straws. Tents that had stood tall minutes earlier now shredded into ribbons. Parks were destroyed. Branches snapped and flew through intersections. Cars were lifted and shoved sideways. Storefronts blew open, their windows shattering in cascades of glass. The change was total. Just half an hour earlier, the city was on lunch break, calm and unsuspecting. Now it was in chaos. People sprinted through alleys. Others crouched in stairwells, clinging to one another. On the interstate, drivers abandoned cars, running for cover beneath overpasses. The tornado did not hesitate. It moved with purpose, block by block, its path aligned with the city's landmarks. Each minute erased another piece of the myth that Salt Lake City was protected by its mountains. The storm's arrival was sudden, but it was not random. The funnel was the product of forces building invisibly all morning. Winds colliding, air rising, and energy storing until the balance broke. The valley, lulled by years of false confidence, had no time to brace for what was already in motion. What came next was not just destruction, but a concerning realization. The storm was proof that even in Utah, even with mountains looming overhead, the atmosphere could turn violent with little warning. The stage was set, and the tornado was only beginning its climb through the heart of the city. The funnel that struck Salt Lake City did not materialize out of nowhere. It was the visible expression of invisible ingredients, air masses colliding, heat rising, and winds twisting through layers of the atmosphere. The storm's ferocity seemed to erupt without warning, but in truth, the signals were there, hidden in the sky, waiting to be read. To understand how this tornado could exist in a place thought nearly immune, it helps to slow the clock, to rewind those minutes before 12:41 p.m. The atmosphere that day carried all the basic requirements of severe storm formation. The first ingredient was moisture. In Utah, dry air usually dominates, but on this August day, the valley held more humidity than usual. Southerly winds funneled moisture northward, and the Great Salt Lake added its own contribution, evaporating into the hot air. The air felt sticky, heavy, something many residents remarked on as odd weather. Meteorologically, moisture near the ground made the air unstable and ready to rise. In everyday terms, it was like tinder waiting for a spark. The second ingredient was instability. Above the surface, colder air pressed in at mid-levels of the atmosphere. Warm, moist air wants to rise. When colder air sits on top, the contrast is like holding a beach ball underwater. Pressure builds until the ball shoots upward. This is what forecasters call instability, and it was present over the Salt Lake Valley that day in abundance. The third ingredient was lift. Something had to kick the warm, unstable air skyward. That afternoon, an upper-level trough was sweeping in from Nevada. At the same time, winds off the Great Salt Lake collided with southerly valley winds, creating what's known as a convergence zone. Picture two crowds of people pushing into each other from opposite directions. Where they meet, pressure builds and bodies push upward. In the atmosphere, this collision forced air to rise rapidly. The final ingredient was wind shear, the change of wind direction and speed with height. Near the surface, winds blew one way. Higher up, they shifted to another. This twisting motion in the vertical layers of air is what allows a thunderstorm to rotate, forming a supercell capable of producing tornadoes. All four ingredients were present, stacked like rungs on a ladder: moisture, instability, lift, and wind shear. When combined, they turn ordinary thunderstorms into something more dangerous. The simplest metaphor for what happened over Salt Lake that day is a kitchen one. Imagine a pot of water on the stove. At first, it simmers quietly, heat building beneath the surface. Place a lid on it, and the pressure grows. Eventually, steam forces its way out, rattling the lid, sending bursts of vapor into the air. On August 11, 1999, the Salt Lake Valley was that pot. The moisture and instability were the water. The trough was the heat. The convergence zone was the lid being pressed down, and the wind shear was the twist in the steam that turned rising bubbles into a spinning column. For years, Utahns believed their mountains acted like a permanent lid, something that would always hold storms in check. That belief collapsed just as surely as the roof panels torn from the Delta Center. Even Governor Levitt, sitting in his office at the Capitol that morning, remembered brushing off the possibility.
My assistant, who had lived in Texas, looked out the window and said, "This is tornado weather." And I said, "We don't get tornadoes in Utah."
This disbelief was not ignorance. It was a reflection of climatology. Utah averages only about 2 tornadoes per year, most of them weak, short-lived, and confined to open fields or sparsely populated areas. They are rarely destructive and almost never strike the heart of a major city. For decades, the statistical odds seem to support the myth of safety. The 1999 storm tore those odds apart. Meteorologists now point to the role of the Great Salt Lake in amplifying conditions. The lake is a shallow, sprawling body of water that can generate localized breezes, pushing moist air into convergence zones. On that August afternoon, winds off the lake collided with valley winds at just the wrong angle, enhancing lift at the precise spot where the thunderstorm was already intensifying. This collision helped the storm rotate more violently, feeding the funnel that would soon touch down. By 12:30 p.m., radar scans began to show that rotation. The thunderstorm cell in the northern valley was no longer ordinary. It was organizing, tightening, building energy. On the ground, people noticed only that the sky was darkening, that the air felt heavier, that a strange restlessness seemed to pulse through the streets. The convergence of forces reached its breaking point at 12:35 p.m. The storm intensified sharply. Rising air columns tilted and twisted, the rotation aloft stretching downward like an invisible drill bit carving toward the ground. The pot had boiled over. From that moment, the countdown began. In 6 minutes, the storm would produce a tornado. In 6 minutes, Salt Lake City's skyline would be pierced by something no one expected to see there. As the storm matured, the rotation tightened further. Wind shear twisted the storm's updraft into a corkscrew. Downdrafts of cooler air wrapped around it, creating the balance needed for a funnel to form. To most eyes, it still looked like a dark cloudburst, a threatening but familiar summer thunderstorm. Only trained meteorologists and radar technicians could see the structure taking shape inside. But nature does not wait for comprehension. At 12:41 p.m., the storm's invisible rotation became visible reality. The funnel touched down near 1300 south and 600 west. Sparks erupted as power lines snapped. The tornado was born. For Utahns, it was a revelation. A force they had believed belonged elsewhere, to the Great Plains and far-off news stories, had taken shape in their own capital. The idea of immunity had been nothing more than a comforting myth. In that moment, the city's narrative changed forever. By 12:41 p.m., what had been a thunderstorm was now a predator moving through downtown Salt Lake. At 12:41 p.m., the first scars appeared on Salt Lake City's west side. The funnel reached the ground near 1300 south and 600 west, a black column twisting into being, wide enough to dwarf the streets below. What had been an invisible rotation in the sky only moments earlier now had a body, a core of swirling debris and dirt that made its presence undeniable. The sound deepened into a freight train roar, and then came the flashes. Transformers along the power lines arced in bright pink bursts, sudden explosions of light against the darkening sky. The electricity of the city met the electricity of the storm, and for a few seconds, downtown looked as if it were under siege. Witnesses later remembered the sight vividly, sparks raining down, entire blocks plunged into darkness, the air alive with the smell of ozone. The tornado's first grip on the city tore loose pieces of roofing, fences, and signage. Light debris spiraled upward, a forewarning of what was about to follow. Cars parked along the street rocked in place, windows rattled violently, and then glass began to shatter. Each block the tornado crossed seemed to feed it. The winds tightened, debris added weight and density, and by 12:45 p.m., the National Weather Service would later confirm the tornado had intensified to F2 strength. Its winds surged into the range of 113 to 157 miles per hour, powerful enough to uproot large trees, peel roofs from homes, and hurl lumber like spears through the air. Traffic on Interstate 15 was directly in its path. Drivers who only seconds earlier were focused on the lunch hour rush suddenly faced a churning wall of black. Some slammed on brakes, abandoning vehicles and sprinting for underpasses or embankments. Others froze in place, gripping steering wheels as debris clattered across hoods and windshields. Just beyond the freeway, the tornado aimed itself at one of Salt Lake City's most iconic landmarks, the Delta Center, home of the Utah Jazz. It was a symbol of pride for the city, a gleaming arena that only a few years earlier had hosted the NBA Finals. Now it stood vulnerable in the storm's path. From the air, news cameras captured the strike. The footage would replay for days, seared into memory. What made the event so terrifying was not only the violence, but the speed. In barely 4 minutes, the storm had escalated from an emerging funnel to a full F2 tornado chewing through the city's core. Residents had no sirens, no history of drills, no ingrained muscle memory to fall back on. They were improvising survival in real time, facing an enemy they had been told would never come. The tornado's path was aligning itself with some of the city's busiest streets and most visible landmarks. It was as if the storm made a conscious division to map itself onto the identity of Salt Lake, tearing through the myth of safety with each turn of debris. By 12:45 p.m., the funnel had matured into a monster. The city's illusions were gone. The next blocks would test its resilience in ways no one had imagined. But the funnel's most tragic target lay just blocks ahead. By the time the tornado crossed Interstate 15 and ripped into the Delta Center, its path had already become infamous. But the storm's next target would bring devastation to a place filled not with commuters or office workers, but with exhibitors, builders, and laborers. Ordinary people setting up for one of the city's most celebrated gatherings. Across the street from the Salt Palace Convention Center, a tent city sprawled across asphalt parking lots and plazas. It was a temporary village built for the outdoor retailer trade show, a national event that transformed Salt Lake City into the center of the outdoor industry twice each year. Thousands of exhibitors came to showcase their latest climbing harnesses, skis, tents, waterproof jackets, and gear designed for survival in the wild. Ironically, it was inside this cluster of steel frames and canvas that the storm would deliver its most tragic blow. The setup stretched like a maze of white canopies, each tent the size of a small house. Workers had been there since morning, sweating under the heavy air, hammering poles into place, tightening bolts, stringing banners. Cardboard boxes sat half opened, with merchandise spilling onto tables. The wind was already rising when the tornado veered toward them. A few minutes earlier, many had heard or felt the roar, but it still seemed distant, like a storm moving behind the mountains. Now the roar was closing in, and the canvas walls began to ripple like sails straining against a storm at sea. And then it struck. The tornado's core plowed into the tent city with full force. Canvas imploded inward, ripping from its seams. Steel frames twisted like paperclips, poles collapsing in dominoes that crashed onto tables and displays. Merchandise exploded into the air. Jackets, catalogs, tents, kayaks, even mannequins lifted skyward in a chaotic blizzard of nylon and metal. Workers scrambled in every direction. Some sprinted toward the solid walls of the Salt Palace. Others grabbed at anything fixed, trees, poles, even tent legs, trying to hold on against the pull of the wind. One survivor remembered it in searing detail.
I ran over to that thing, put a death grip on it. I'm holding onto that tree with everything I had.
30 feet away, Darren emerges from behind the car, but he can't find his buddy. All alone in the blinding winds, Darren tries to feel his way to shelter. He inches along until he finds the base of another tree. Gripping the trunk, he holds on for a rough ride.
I had my fingernails stuck right inside the bark, and I had my head down. My legs were flying back and forth. I just remember thinking, I'm not gonna make it. Something's gonna hit me. I'm gonna lose my grip. Waiting to die, just the worst.
Several yards away, Scott is struggling to keep hold of his own tree branch.
The freakiest part was my feet coming off the ground. If it had enough power to lift me off the ground, there's no telling where I'd end up.
The image is almost too vivid. A person clinging to bark while the storm lifted them like a rag doll, legs flailing as debris whipped past. The roar drowned out everything else. It was deafening. An unbroken wall of noise as tents collapsed and poles snapped. Exhibitors who had been joking minutes earlier now found themselves crawling beneath tables, shielding heads with their arms, praying canvas wouldn't rip away. Others simply dropped to the asphalt, pressed flat against the ground as debris slashed overhead. In the chaos, one man could not escape. Alan A. Crandy, a 38-year-old construction worker, was caught in the collapse of metal and canvas. He became the storm's only fatality. His death underscored the fragility of life when confronted with raw atmospheric power. More than 80 others would be injured across the city that day, many of them here, among the tents and steel of the trade show site. Rescue workers arrived within minutes. Police and firefighters moved through the wreckage, checking for trapped survivors, shouting above the din of still howling winds. Ambulances crowded the streets, ferrying the injured to hospitals. Nearby, hospital staff prepared for an influx, triaging patients who arrived with cuts, broken bones, and concussions. In total, dozens were treated that day from injuries sustained in the outdoor retailer site alone. For Salt Lake City, however, the tent city stood as the storm's most painful memory. The tragedy at the outdoor retailer site deepened the storm's legacy. It was not just property lost, it was a life taken and dozens of lives altered. For survivors, the sound of tearing canvas, the weight of steel beams collapsing, and the memory of being lifted off the ground by the wind became scars far beyond the physical. The funnel did not pause to grieve. It climbed northward, ascending toward higher ground, its winds still violent, its roar still unbroken. Ahead lay the Capitol, its domed roof gleaming, and the shaded canyon of Memory Grove, filled with towering cottonwoods and tranquil lawns. The storm was about to prove another rarity, a tornado that could climb nearly 1,100 feet in elevation. carving its path not just across a city, but up into the very heart of its hillside. Even as tragedy struck downtown, the tornado was climbing higher, toward the heart of Utah's capital. The funnel did not weaken as it tore past the wreckage of the outdoor retailer tents. Instead, it climbed. This was one of the most unusual and terrifying features of the 1999 Salt Lake City tornado. Its ability to move not just across a flat valley floor, but upward, scaling nearly 1,100 feet of elevation from its touchdown point to where it finally dissipated. Tornadoes rarely climb hills with such determination. Yet here it was, ascending toward the seat of Utah's government. The path carried the funnel directly toward the Capitol grounds. The domed building, perched on a bluff north of downtown, had always seemed untouchable. Its marble steps and stately rotunda had weathered protests, parades, and the ordinary passage of time. But this day, the Capitol became a front-row witness to nature's fury. Construction crews had been working nearby, raising scaffolding around structures and operating cranes that towered over the streets. As the tornado approached, the scaffolding twisted in seconds, collapsing like a child's toy. A 90-ton crane suffered damage as the winds lashed against it, steel groaning before surrendering to the pull of the vortex. Workers fled, abandoning equipment, scrambling for shelter in basements and stairwells. The funnel pressed onward, its roar echoing off the stone of government buildings. Windows rattled in the offices of state employees. Papers flew through broken panes, swirling into the air like frantic birds. And then the tornado made its entrance into Memory Grove, the shaded canyon park tucked beneath the Capitol. Memory Grove was a place of peace, lined with paths, monuments, and trees that had stood for generations. In an instant, the storm transformed it. The winds ripped into the grove, uprooting hundreds of mature cottonwoods. Branches as wide as beams cracked like matchsticks. Entire trunks toppled, blocking paths and crushing benches. In seconds, what had been a sanctuary became unrecognizable. One official later described it with quiet sadness.
Coming in, and the first visual was like, wow, what happened? Trees were just sticks. There was debris everywhere. This monument right here, this bell tower, there were trees all the way around it that just laid right down, and the monument stood. The tornado really wiped what was a tranquil park into, just something that was just not what people were used to seeing. The outdoor retailers, they had their annual event. They had the tent set up down off 3rd West, and it actually blew the roof off that. And then it just proceeded up the hill and through the Capitol grounds and destroyed, all the trees there, and then dropped in here. The path that tornado came through was just up and over this hill. We feel like it almost bounced in the park before actually exiting up and over. So all these trees were on the banks of the slopes of the hills. The trees in the park, we lost them. The day of the tornado, we actually mobilized staff. We were here for 12 hours that day. And it actually took us 12 days with all hands on deck to get the park safe, opened up where the people could start using it. But it was a lot of hours and a lot of staff, from our streets department, public utilities. We had one contractor actually come in and say, hey, I want to help, and just donated his time and his equipment just to help us get the park cleaned up. So there was this sense of community, and just how can we help? When I see people in our parks, it's kind of a reward of what we do. That's why we do it for the public and for their enjoyment. And to be able to see, these trees that have been in the ground now for almost 20 years, it's nice to see the park starting to come back. I love what I do. I love the challenges of every day. I love working with the staff, and being able to see, the citizens and the public be able to use our parks is rewarding. Right now we have a needs assessment, something that Parks and Public Lands has never done before. And so anyone interested could go on that website and definitely take the survey and tell us what you think.
The tornado had erased the park's identity in less time than it takes to walk its length. When the winds finally passed, Memory Grove was a tangle of fallen trees and splintered wood. But the response came quickly. Crews arrived within hours. Volunteers joined city crews, dragging branches, clearing debris, restoring some semblance of order to the wreckage. The tornado, however, had not yet finished its climb. By the time it reached the avenue's neighborhood, perched above the grove, it was near the end of its life. Roofs peeled, porches sagged, and trees crashed into power lines. But the funnel was weakening. By the time it reached the upper streets of the avenues, its climb was nearly over, but its legacy was just beginning. The tornado lifted near 20th Avenue and P Street. Its visible funnel unraveled into the clouds, and the valley exhaled a broken kind of silence. The storm was gone, but the evidence of its passage was everywhere. The tornado had traveled roughly 4.25 miles, maintaining F2 intensity for about 10 minutes. At its widest, it stretched nearly 200 yards across, easily wide enough to consume city blocks. It left behind a scar visible both from the ground and from the sky, a crooked path of debris that cut through the heart of Utah's capital. The toll was staggering for a state so unaccustomed to tornadoes. 1 life lost, more than 80 injured, nearly $170 million in damages. Entire businesses disrupted, hundreds of homes damaged or destroyed. Early reports listed 121 homes damaged, with 34 deemed uninhabitable. The final tallies expanded the scope. More than 300 buildings and houses affected, many with shattered windows, collapsed porches, or ripped-off roofs. On State Street and through downtown, glass littered the sidewalks in glittering drifts. Cars sat crumpled beneath fallen trees. Storefronts were hollowed out, their insides exposed to the open air. And Memory Grove, the city's peaceful retreat, was devastated. 500 trees destroyed, 300 more heavily damaged, an entire portion of the park obliterated, the canopy ripped away in minutes. Where there had been shade and quiet, there was now sunlight pouring onto heaps of splintered wood. Downtown looked as if a siege had taken place, and the survivors bore the same stunned expressions as those stepping out into a world they barely recognized. In total, the storm's passage lasted less than a quarter of an hour. Yet it transformed the city's landscape and psychology. In the days and weeks that followed, Salt Lake City confronted a new reality. The tornado of August 11, 1999, had exposed the myth of immunity. The storm sparked questions of preparedness. Why had the warning been so short? What systems could be improved? How could a community so unaccustomed to tornadoes begin to build resilience against them? In the years after, changes came. Meteorologists in Utah sharpened their focus on convergence zones and lake breeze interactions, understanding that the Great Salt Lake could amplify storms in ways previously underestimated. Communication systems evolved, from TV alerts to mobile push notifications. City planners folded the memory of 1999 into their emergency planning. But beyond the technical improvements was something less tangible and more profound. A change in mindset. Salt Lake residents could no longer dismiss tornado warnings as irrelevant. They had seen what a funnel could do to their own neighborhoods. On August 11, 1999, Salt Lake City lost a life, endured millions in damage, and shed a myth that had stood for generations. The storm that rose 1,000 feet taught Utah a lesson we all need. Preparation is survival and respect for nature.